everybody. Welcome back to For the Love of Reading, the podcast sponsored by Highlights for Children. I'm Christine French Cully, your podcast host and editor-in-chief of Highlights. Today, we're talking about picture books and how the right picture books, shared in a thoughtful and intentional way, can help open up conversations with young kids about race, equity, and inclusion. My guest today fully acknowledges that these conversations can be challenging, but she works to make them easier and more fruitful. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Christine Herring, a nationally recognized educator and consultant who, along with her husband, Dr. Chuck Herring, works with organizations including individual schools and school districts to help build more productive conversations about equity and inclusion. Dr. Herring has been a teacher of young children, a lifelong lover of books, and she is a parent. Wearing all these hats, she wrote her doctoral thesis on using books to help kids learn about social justice. I first met Dr. Herring a few months ago and I was drawn to her commitment to her work and her passion for kids, books, and for making the world a better place, a more harmonious place. Dr. Herring, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Christine. I am honored and excited to be here.
Let's begin by learning a little bit more about you. Were you a big reader as a child, and what influences led you to become an educator?
Well, as a child, I loved reading. I had a younger sister who's 2 years younger than me, and we often played library, which ended up being a tradition that I passed on to my three daughters. And people find that odd, like, how do you play library? And basically, being a lover of books, we had a room where we just created it and turned it into our own library. So my daughters started off early enjoying going to the library. We always participated in the summer reading programs. And then they would come home and pretend to be librarians and check out books to each other and check out books to me. And so I would definitely say as a young girl, I loved books and passed that tradition on to my own daughters.
Thank you for sharing that story. I'm always fascinated to hear how our childhood loves and pastimes become deeply embedded into who we are and influence who we become and what we end up doing as adults and even how we parent. So it all started at a very young age for you.
It started at a young age. And the books, what I found with my own children is that anything that I wanted to teach them, I could do it through a book. What I found is that books help children to remove themselves from the situation, and they get to see the situation through the lens of someone else. So when they would have a problem as a child, if I wanted to teach them about manners or about something, sharing or being kind, if I found a book and they got to see how that character reacted to that situation, they often began to reflect on themselves, or it gave me a door to open to say, oh, you know what? This reminds me of when you were on the playground and whatever the situation may be. How do you think you could have handled it differently than the character in the book? Or how could the character in the book have handled it differently if it wasn't always for things that they did wrong, but sometimes they did something really good that I wanted to highlight. And so my love for using books to teach started with my own girls. A difficult thing, though, I found with them is finding books that provided mirrors for them. And what I mean by mirrors is where they saw themselves reflected in the book. And so that was a hard task, being able to find books where they could see themselves. And so I became this, at that time, I didn't realize it, but I was starting my journey of being a researcher because I was often searching for books where they were reflected in them. And then that also opened up conversations for my girls and I to talk about why there weren't books that reflected them. And what could we do about that? And so also then that led to the piece where in my doctoral work, we talked about critical literacy. We started talking about who the authors of the books were and how that impacted who the characters looked like and the versions of the story. And so I began to, at a very early age, help them develop critical literacy skills to start questioning books, and that everything that you read in a book is not always accurate. You need to ask the questions of who wrote the book, whose voice is missing from the book. How would the book be told differently if it was told from a different perspective? So it was really my children who inspire a lot of my work as an educator. And I have to say, even as adults, they're amazing women and they still inspire me.
That's wonderful. So, those kinds of conversations that you had with your children when they were young about how to think about a book and the book's author and the book's story, they may sound a little to our listeners like the kind of conversations teachers would have in a classroom, but you think parents can have those kind of conversations with their kids as well.
I think that parents definitely should be the starters of those conversations, because the one thing I tried to teach my own children, and even when I got into the classroom, I taught my students, is that no one person is the holder of all knowledge. And so we want our children to look at things through a critical lens and to realize that people bring themselves into everything that they do. And when teachers read a book to a student, even in the way that they're presenting that book, if they're not asking that student questions about the book and asking them to think about what was the purpose why do you think the author even wrote this book? I always started all read alouds with that question. Before we'd even get into the book, I would say to my students, I want you to think why the author wrote this book, and what is it that the author wants you to take away from this book. Sometimes it would just be for entertainment, but oftentimes we found that there were a lot of lessons that could be gleaned from a book. And through that's when I started my social justice work, because even a book as simple as The Three Little Pigs, most people know that story. But The Three Little Pigs has a very, very interesting lesson in it. The Three Little Pigs can help students understand about a single story. When we think of The Three Little Pigs, most of us think of The Three Little Pigs as the good characters and the wolf as the bad character. But what if the story was told from the perspective of the wolf? How might that story be changed? Maybe it was the three little pigs who were the bad people. And maybe if the wolf was telling the story, where there is actually a book, and I would contrast those two with my students, where the wolf tells the story of how the three little pigs were out to get him. And so my students very early on learned just through this children's fairy tale about beware of a single story, because a single story creates stereotypes that we don't even realize are being created. And so when I would use this book, these two books in my classroom, I often used it to help students understand how to be good listeners. Because when you think someone, you as a teacher, you get so-and-so said this to me, so-and-so's bullying me. And when we would sit down and unpack the situation, most of the time it was just a misunderstanding. And it was because of a single story that even teachers have to be careful of. You hear one version of a story and you think automatically you can jump to conclusions that this student is wrong over here until you hear their perspective. And so you can take tons of regular books. They don't have to be books. I use a lot of books that have social justice, that are intended to be used for social justice themes, but you can use fairy tales with very young children to start teaching them about social justice ideas and about being kind, empathetic, and being good listeners, and working out problems with their friends, understanding perspectives.
Well, I have two thoughts. One is that that's one of the best definitions of single story that I've heard. And that's a phrase we're hearing a lot these days, single story. And I'm not sure, it's as well understood as it might be. And so that illustration of the three little pigs is really helpful. Um, and then the idea of using fairy tales to talk about things like social justice is really interesting because I think for some people, when you talk about using books in this way, they immediately go to the stories of, people who've suffered, and particularly it suffered because of the color of their skin or some other difference. We don't think about it as also being a factor in some fairy tales, something that everybody can experience.
In my work, so I spent a lot of my years in the classroom teaching first and second grade. And what prompted me to do my doctoral work around using picture books to teach young children about social justice themes is that there's a lot of research that talks about how teachers feel that young children that they're too young. Talking about social justice is with young children is inappropriate. We don't want them to see color. We want them to be colorblind. We want them to, this is too heavy. But what a lot of adults don't understand is that it's the adults that are uncomfortable about talking about social justice themes with young children, and young children are already navigating social justice themes when they are in kindergarten, and adults don't even realize it. And so I have found that it is best to have those conversations where they can be guided, where you can help point out misconceptions, and you can give children accurate information as opposed to shutting it down. Like, I remember I had a teacher share with me that she was colorblind. And she said, I just think that children shouldn't see color. And I said, but that's such a misconception because children start seeing differences in race as early as 6 months. And there's research out here to support that. And I said, when you say you don't see color, what you say is you don't see me, because the skin that I live in creates a certain type of experience for me. And if you don't respect or understand or even want to entertain that, then you're telling me that you don't see me. So you can't stand in front of me and not see that my skin is black. And that because of my black skin, I have had to navigate this world differently. And so it was a different way for her to think about it. And I also, expressed that children see color. They just do, and I have had students have conversations or come up and talk to me to say, someone said my skin looks like the color of poop. And adults get all upset. And it's like, that's not the way to handle it. The way you handle it is you talk about that. What do you mean by that? Do you understand how that impacts your friend when you say something like that? That let's look at skin color and where it comes from. And there are books that talk about the pigmentation and how we get our skin color. And I do a really cool activity. I used to do a really cool activity at the beginning of the school year where I would have students. It's called All the Colors of the World, I think is the name of the book. And they mix paints. So it talks about, it tells you the paints that you need to mix to get certain colors. So the kids would mix the paints to get their skin tone, and they would practice on each other to match it, to say, oh, does that work? Does that work? And then everyone would do their self-portraits with their skin tone. And the book is beautiful because it talks about, it aligns the color of your skin with different kinds of foods. And so the kids really like it. And then we talk about, like, after they create their skin tone, then they give it a name and we hang up our self-portraits, and they absolutely love it. And that sets the tone that when you go through the rest of the school year, whenever they draw people, they give people color. And there's nothing that's inappropriate or hard for them to handle. they understand right away. And that dispels that conversation about your skin is the color of poop. No, my skin is the color of chocolate, or my skin is the color of caramels, or my skin, so now we've given them language to use to describe their friends that is not offensive or hurtful to someone.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And it sounds like something you can do with very young children.
With very young, first grade, kindergarten. I've done it. I've done it with as early as kindergarten, and first, second grade, and older kids. You can take an act. I've done this activity with adults. A seminar that I held with adults. We did the activity, and they loved it. Mixing the colors, trying to find. I mean, you would these graduate students were like kindergartners, mixing up the paints and drawing themselves and creating their portraits, and we hung them around the room. And so it's an activity that can be used across all ages.
Yeah, yeah. That notion of being colorblind and that being a good thing is really a hard one to sort of dismantle. We hear that a lot, but I think working with children in this way, adults can learn too to find a level of comfort with that and to celebrate it.
And using a book, while my dissertation work was around using picture books to teach children social justice themes, those same picture books can be used with adults, because we're all at different places on our journey, and it can be uncomfortable for adults to talk about race and sexual orientation and all these things. Race seems to be the one that creates the most tension. But looking at it through a book, using prompts from a book, it just sort of takes that fear of saying the wrong thing or not knowing what to say out of the room to start the conversation, because now you can talk about the characters. And once you're starting talking about the characters, you often find that someone will be able to speak to an example or an experience that they've had. And it moves just seamlessly from we're talking about these characters to now we're actually engaging in a conversation around social justice that's including us or people we know.
Yeah, a beautifully written picture book is appeals to both children and adults, and they stay with us. It's almost like comfort foods sometimes. The ways they make us feel, we remember the rest of our lives, and we reach for those books often to share with our children and our grandchildren, but also to remind ourselves of the truths they contain. So I love that you've identified picture books as a really wonderful tool to have these conversations, open up these conversations and have them with both children and adults. So the idea of skin color and talking about that is kind of a very fundamental way to begin to talk about social justice. Are there other basic truths, I guess, or basic ideas that parents of young children should think about talking to their kids about using books? I think sometimes when we talk about using books to teach kids about social justice, we do turn to some of the events of history, and they can be traumatizing to some children because, frankly, there's a lot of cruelty in them and sometimes violence and just things that are upsetting. Eventually, we want kids to know those stories. They have to experience the discomfort that comes with hearing those stories. But for young children, are there things that we should be doing first to sort of, give them context or get them ready for the more difficult aspects of teaching them social justice?
The first thing that I say is that you should always read the book first. And depending on the student's age and their ability to comprehend, you need to know that, and you want to read the book first to see if, number one, are there too many words on the page? Am I going to lose them by the first page because it's just too dense? And all picture books are not equal. So some picture books are actually geared for older children, and some picture books are more geared for younger children. If you find a picture book that you really enjoy, or you really, there's a lesson that you really want to get out of it, and it has a lot of denseness or a lot of words, you can paraphrase. That's why I always say read the book first. Make yourself notations on what you want to bring out if it's too much, if you can't just read it straight as a book. But to answer your question, after you've done those very minor things of making sure you're familiar with the book and you understand what you're trying to get out of the book. I have an example of a really interesting story about a book that I used with my students to show them how to use critical literacy skills. There was a book put out by Scholastics called A Birthday Cake for George Washington. Are you familiar with that book?
I do know the story of that book.
And as soon as it came out, they pulled it. And I heard about it and I wanted the book and I couldn't get it. And so I was sharing with one of my daughters, I want this book. So she started on a journey of trying to find the book for me. And I didn't realize that. And I was trying to find the book. Well, I found the book, and the person who was selling the book for $80, a $12 book. But I wanted that book because I wanted to use that book. I had actually met the illustrator of the book, and her story was phenomenal. It was really sad because the whole premise of why they pulled the book is that there was controversy around the illustrations that she made. It was about George Washington's chef was making him a cake for his birthday, and his daughter was helping him, and they were depicted as being happy. And people really got upset about that book to say that it was inappropriate to depict slaves as being happy because of the context. Children could believe that slavery was a fun, happy time, just to summarize. And so I wanted this book because I was like, I need to see this. But I also wanted it because I wanted to present it to my students, and I wanted to get their input on it. So I have to say, though, I had done a lot of work with my kids prior to that. So we read a lot of books like The Sit-In, and we've had a lot of conversation. And so they had context around social justice issues.
And how old were these students?
They were, at the time that we were talking about this book, were second grade, but I looped with my students. So I had them for first and second grade. So I started in first grade, building a foundation. We would do different books and projects around those books, so they understood the context, and I built up their capacity, so to speak. And so this particular book I wanted to get because I wanted to have them evaluate the book and give their opinion on what they felt the book was saying. And I gave them the whole context of why the book was pulled, how I couldn't find the book, how I paid. And another piece of that is that my daughter also found the book, and the person that she found the book from wanted $100 for the book. So now we have these two books. we spent $180 to obtain I didn't know she bought it, and she didn't know I had found mine. So I was like, that's okay, because they are teaching tools. And I think books are invaluable. And so I got the book, and I read the book to my students. But prior to that, I told them the story of the artist and how the book was pulled and why it was pulled. And I said, I want you to be able to share what your thoughts are. Why do you think that the illustrator may have drew the pictures the way she did? And from whose perspective is this story being told? And how would this story look different, and possibly the illustrations be different if the story was being told from a different perspective? Let's say, what if George Washington's chef or cook was telling the story? How might he tell the story differently, and how might that impact the illustrations? Because I just didn't believe a book should be pulled. I feel that conversations should be held about the book, and conversations to help people understand what was problematic and how can we fix what was problematic, or how can we supplement what was problematic. Why are we just going to pull the book? And the conversations that came from the reading of this book from my students, I remember some of the comments. One was, well, maybe the illustrator was trying to show that even though this was a really bad time and it was horrible, the father didn't want his daughter to only know sad times. So he tried to make some happy times for her. And, which is a very plausible explanation. While it was a horrible time during slavery, how did people survive? And this could have been a survival technique to sing, to be happy, to dance. All of these things could have been taking place as survival techniques. And so the students really dug deeply, and then they end up writing letters they wanted to write letters to the illustrator to express their concern for her and how people may have misinterpreted her illustrations. And it just was such a rich lesson. And so you can take books that have historical context and use them with young children. The only thing that I caution, though, is that we don't want to, especially for Black children, provide books that create a sense of pity and a sense of woe is me, and you're the only thing that they see is books that show them from a deficit. I really caution against that. So you have to be very intentional about the books that you choose, the messages that those books are given, and to also be sure to put books in front of kids, and not just for Black kids, because you don't want white children to also only see Black people from a deficit perspective. And so you have to be careful to be able to tell the stories, but and share the stories, but in a way that where you know that the child is ready for that information, and that you're not only telling the story from a deficit perspective, that you're talking about the strength and the wonderfulness of people of color, and not just from this enslaved mentality and in the way that a lot of our literature portrays Black people.
That is such an important point. The way you used that book in your classroom, Dr. Herring, is so interesting and remarkable, really. It highlights, we too have on occasion published a few things that we, looking back, know we could have done better. And to talk about those missteps or those mistakes, to own up to them, that is to continue to learn and grow. That is how we're going to move along on our journey to becoming more sensitive and more thoughtful, and to doing better for our young readers who deserve the very best we can give them. Listeners, I want you to know that Dr. Herring has provided us with a list of her favorite picture books, and we will include that in our show notes. Dr. Herring has also offered her email address to any listener who may have a question, and that will be in our show notes as well. You can read more about Dr. Herring and the work she and her husband, Dr. Chuck Herring, do right there. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you again, Dr. Herring, for joining us. This has been a wonderful conversation and so important.
Oh, you are so welcome, and thank you for having me today. This was a lot of fun.
For show notes and information about other episodes in our podcast series, visit us at loveofreading.highlights.com.
My name is William, and I'm 8 years old. I like to read my books at school in a quiet place.
Hey parents, find more great videos on Highlights for Grown-ups, the channel that helps you help your kids be their best selves.